Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 55, The Pastoralist. Cuthbert Featherstonaught's name has popped up in some of my past episodes. His encounter with Blue Cap the Bushranger in episode 29 and his friendship with the Broughton family in episode 42, Rose Lodge. I was intrigued to know more about this man. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh was born on the 22nd of June 1837 at their family home, Dardistown, in County Westmeath, Ireland, the day Queen Victoria came to the throne. He was the son of Cuthbert Featherstonaugh and his wife Susan, née Curtis. And we're lucky enough to have a copy of Cuthbert Featherstonaught's memoirs, which gave interesting insight into his early life. The name of the warrior who founded the family was Frithilstan, and is so written in the Old Saxon Chronicles and other records. That branch, after the Norman conquest, was called Featherstone-Daha. Richard Featherstonaugh was chaplain to Queen Catherine of Aragon and conducted the pleadings in the affair of the divorce with so much zeal that the king had him beheaded in 1540. In 1651, Sir Timothy Featherstonaugh, who was in arms for the king, was taken prisoner at Wigan and beheaded at Chester by Milton, one of Cromwell's colonels. His eldest son Henry was also slain in the Battle of Worcester, fighting on the king's side. This devoted loyalty to the crown met with no return from Charles II. Even the family estates were not restored. Sir Henry Featherstonaugh, a grandson of Sir Albany, died in 1746, aged 100, without issue, discarding his nephew William Henry in the direct line, and appointed Matthew Featherstonaugh, a more distant relative, for his heir. This gentleman was created a baronet in 1774, leaving one son, the late baronet, who left no issue, so the title became extinct. William Henry married Miss Shafto and impoverished himself on the turf. His son William, after fruitless attempts to retrieve his fortunes, died in Yorkshire at an advanced age. His son George died young in 1780, leaving an only son, now His Majesty's Consul, in France. There are branches of this ancient family in Cumberland and in Ireland. Some of the family went to Ireland in the time of Cromwell and acquired estates there. The Featherstonaghs of Kirkswold have always taken distinguished rank with the gentry of that country in Cumberland and have for its head in Ireland Sir George Featherstonaugh. So his father sold Dardistown in 1843 under the Encumbered Estates Act for economy's sake, as Cuthbert explained in his memoir. The family consisted of his parents and 7 siblings, and they moved to Neuwied, Germany, as living and education were much cheaper there. Then Frankfurt, where they lived for 4 years until the Revolution. They returned to Ireland in 1848 and rented in County Westmeath, and then moved on to Kingstown on the sea near Dublin. Cuthbert attended school in Frankfurt and Wales and later the Belfast Academy. In 1852, his father, 2 brothers and a cousin, Travers Adamson, later a Crown prosecutor in Melbourne, left Ireland for Victoria, joining the gold rush. One brother returned home due to ill health before Cuthbert left for Australia. In May 1853, Cuthbert followed with 5 of his relations on the ship the Sussex. He reunited with his father and brother and arrived in Melbourne broke. Within 3 days, he obtained a position as a wharf clerk with Lyle, Mackenzie and Company for £2 10 shillings a week. He soon noticed that dairymen were doing very well for themselves. He passed this observation on to his brother, who with a friend purchased 4 horses, drays and a harness, and was employed with them, clearing £5 a week. In 1855, he next went surveying on the upper Goulburn River and then trapped horses with Hunter and Peter Snodgrass in the ranges. And there's more detail on Peter Snodgrass in episode 33, Lady Janet. In 1856, Cuthbert's mother and 5 sisters came out to join the family. Persuaded by his mother to take on more steady employment, Cuthbert worked on Edward Henty's Muntham Run near Hamilton in Victoria for 6 years, which was close to his family. With Tom Clibborn, Featherstonaugh laid out the Coleraine steeplechase and won repute as one of the most daredevil riders of the Western District. Featherstonaugh left Muntham in 1862 and went to Queensland, where his two partners visited Banban Station near Gayndah on the Burnett River on the 16th of January 1863, which they soon purchased. Travelling further north, Cuthbert was stricken with dysentery. On recovery, he brought a lease on Burton Downs, 482 kilometres north of Rockhampton, in June 1863, but after a 3-year struggle, he abandoned the lease. He then managed Tynwald Downs after that until April 1866. Although short on money and with diminished vitality, he remained adventurous. He assisted police in getting Frank Gardner the bushranger, from Apis Creek, Queensland on the 3rd of March 1864 to Rockhampton, and Frank Gardner is covered in episode 39. He also had an encounter with the bushranger Blue Cap and his gang in 1868 when managing Brookong Station in New South Wales, which he managed until March 1872. In 1871, he resigned from Brookong Station. Featherstonaugh underwent a religious experience in 1865, and in 1872, encouraged by Dean Hussey McCartney, he studied for the Anglican ministry. After acting as a lay reader at Templestowe, Doncaster and Anderson's Creek near Melbourne, he was ordained in the Church of England by the Bishop of Goulburn at Wagga Wagga in July 1873 and took charge of the Brookong, Urannah and Jerilderie parish. His stipend of £300 helped him buy the books he had longed for, but his reading led him to question beliefs he had accepted from childhood. Unable to accept the major Anglican dogma, he resigned in May 1875, but served at Urannah as an unsectarian minister. In 1876, he became manager of Kennelly Station near Balranald, New South Wales, which was 400,000 acres. And on the 16th of November 1876, at Trinity Church in Kew, Melbourne, he married Flora Agnes Murchison, the daughter of Captain John Murchison. Later on in 1876, with partners, he bought Gurianawa Station in the Castlereagh district and managed it for 17 years. In 1886, he helped to form the Commercial and Pastoral Association of New South Wales, and in 1890, the Pastoralist Union. In 1894, he began to advocate inland freezing works and a meat export company. In relevant journals and lectures all over the colony, he sought support for his scheme, and by August, 71,000 shares, a little over £40,000 in dementias, had been taken up. In 1895, he visited Chicago, USA, to engage experts in canning. There's an article at this time alluding to those ventures, Mr. C. Featherstonaugh. Mr. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh, who is leaving Coonabarabran, has been banqueted prior to his departure and his wife presented with a silver tea service. Mr. Featherstonaugh has a genius for organising, and it is mainly due to his efforts and strong personality that the export meat trade has reached its present dimensions. He is the central pivot of the New South Wales Meat Freezing and Export Company. In 1898, when the Stock Owners Meat Export Company was well established, he turned to mining in the Gulf Country. Being successful from this venture, he returned in 1902 to New South Wales and worked as a government land valuer. Featherstonaugh next bought Mungaree, east of Coonamble. In old age, he left its management to his son Cuthbert and lived at Blackheath, his summer home, moving between the two. His last great interest was the Free Kindergarten Union of New South Wales. In 1918, he published in Sydney his lively autobiography, After Many Days, when he was 81, and written, he claims, after much prodding from his wife Flora and friend Walter Henderson. He followed that up with My Religious Experience in 1919, a manuscript that's now in the Mitchell Library. And Walter Henderson's account of Cuthbert's book says, After Many Days is certainly the best book of its kind ever produced in or on Australia. I studied every paragraph in the book in proof form, and I read the finished product with zest, and more than once. Now, on opening it once again for reference, I find a difficulty in putting it down. What a range of varying experience it covers, yet only the first 25 years of Mr. Featherstonagh's life are embraced in it. As a book of reference alone, it will be invaluable to future historians. Its author, with his active mind and a happy faculty for keeping notes and records, has served him well when he came to write it. It is a misfortune that his desire to write out a further volume would not be carried out, though there is a manuscript, about 40 pages of typed matter, dealing with his experiences as a bush parson. How he loved Australia, particularly inland Australia. "I am nothing if not a bushman," he declared, and his book is dedicated to the bushmen of Australia. One must read the book to understand the varied range of his activities as jackaroo, station manager, pastoralist, steeplechase rider, and bush parson. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh died on the 10th of June 1925 when en route to his property near Coonamble in New South Wales, and would have been 88 years old on the 22nd of June. Mentions Cuthbert Featherstonaugh, a dear and valued friend of 34 years standing, has coiled up his ropes and gone to a better place. If ever there lived a British gentleman in every sense of the word, he was one, and all is summed up in that. Wherever he lived in numerous parts of Australia, he was beloved by everyone, and the world is poorer for his death. He took great interest in kindergarten work and was one of the founders of the Golden Fleece branch of the kindergarten in Sydney. He leaves a widow, 2 sons, the elder being Major C. Featherstonaugh, late of the Light Horse, the other Albany, who I believe a resident of Queensland, and one daughter, Mrs. Macmillan. His wife was Florence Murchison, daughter of a very well-known army man. And just as an aside, the Murchison family also have a great story to tell, so I've created a bonus episode, which is bonus episode number 12, to attach to this episode. Cuthbert left an estate worth £3,252. His wife, Flora, died in 1931. Featherstonaugh, November the 5th at the residence of Mrs. E. H. Lightfoot, Melbury Road, Chatswood, suddenly. Flora Agnes, widow of the late Cuthbert Featherstonaugh of Mungery, Coonamble and Blackheath. A little bit about Cuthbert's father and his family. In his memoirs, he talks about his father. "My father, afterwards known far and wide as the Old Governor, brought £8,000 with him to Australia, and my brother and he and my cousin, Travis Adamson, tried their luck at diggings at Bendigo, but without success. My father started gold buying, but was one night robbed of 800 ounces from under his pillow too. Had he only brought land in the suburbs of Melbourne, he must have become very wealthy, which no doubt would have been a most unfortunate thing for me, for instead of having to work hard all my life, I might have become a drone. From my heart and soul, I honestly say I thank God I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Instead of buying land, my father was ill-advised enough to build some stone houses on leased land in Swanson Street opposite the jail. Although at prices for labour and material then ruling, the cost of the buildings for these houses was very great, paid very well for a while. He got £1,000 a year rent for one of them, but this did not last, and eventually the rent and upkeep of the houses barely covered the ground rent, and they were sold. I remember taking my stand in 1854 in a window of one of these houses to see an unfortunate man hanged. After a bit, my father was appointed police magistrate at Buckland River, out from the Ovens, which is now Beechworth. I've often dropped across old diggers from Buckland whose eyes would brighten up when they knew I was the son of the old governor. They all swore by him. In 1855, my father and Puckle, and later on Joe Mason, were moved to the Grange in the Western District of Victoria. I do not think I can do better than, at this stage of my reminiscences, reprint here the sketch of my father that appeared in the Hamilton Spectator on the occasion of his death in 1892 in his 90th year, having lived for nearly 40 years in Hamilton, Victoria. A well-known, venerable, but nevertheless sprightly figure, that of an old colonist respected by all, the man who had a kindly word and a smile for everybody, and upon whom everybody smiled in return, will be seen amongst us no more. The dear old governor is dead. Not an excellency, but the governor for this name, for Mr. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh, who reigned in the hearts of many people of this district, will be better and more fondly remembered than by his ancient and historical family. Now and again he might be addressed as Mr. Featherstone, for short, but the nonagerian who expired at his residence, Corrie, at 5 o'clock on Wednesday, better liked to be addressed by the title given him by his many friends years ago. How it came to be conferred upon him we do not know, but we do know that he was from time to time introduced to various excellencies, including Lord Hopetoun as the governor, and acknowledged by them as such. He was a man amongst men, a genuine unaffected Irish gentleman, which all of the world over is admitted to be the best type of man. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh, born at Grass Lodge, County Westmeath, Ireland, on the 27th of November 1803, was the son of Theobald Featherstonaugh of Mosstown, and had no fewer than 27 brothers and sisters, 17 of whom grew up tall, handsome men and women. In 1827 he married Miss Susan Curtis, who bore him 6 daughters and 3 sons, of whom 5 daughters and 2 sons are still alive. Of her it is said by those who had the pleasure of her acquaintance that she was a devout Christian and faithful friend and helper of the poor and sorrowful. This lady went to her rest in 1871. In 1852 the governor came out to Australia, where about the time gold was said to be so abundant that one could hardly avoid making a fortune. The governor, however, managed to avoid it. 2 of his sons came out with him, and in 1853 he was joined by his younger son Cuthbert. In 1856 he was followed by his wife and 5 daughters, and thus happily united with his loved ones, he strove to make his way in the world. Like many other scions of old families, he tried his luck on the goldfields. He endeavoured in various ways to make a fortune, but felt his lack of commercial knowledge, and whilst making a large pecuniary loss, merely gained experience. But he was an educated man, and his attainments in 1854 enabled him to secure a position of police magistrate at the Buckland River. He soon became a well-known figure to the diggers, and his cheery manner, straightforwardness and never-failing courtesy quickly gained for him the popularity he never subsequently forfeited. About 1855, Mr. Featherstonaugh came to Hamilton, which was then known as the Grange. The governor's jurisdiction extended from Hamilton to Casterton, Coleraine, Digby, Braxholm, and in fact over the country of which those were and still are the centres. There were no bridges across rivers or creeks, but blow high, blow low, with rivers running bankers, he had periodically to put in an appearance at all those places and administer the law. He was always well mounted, was as regular as clockwork in his rounds, and never once failed in keeping his official appointments to the day and to the very minute. This, although many a time and oft, in order to reach his destination, had to swim the Wannon and the creek on the banks of which the town of Coleraine is situated when in flood. Many were the narrow escapes he had from being carried away. Needless to add that such a man received a hearty welcome wherever he went, and so he continued honestly and zealously to perform his allotted tasks until 1869. His services were dispensed with and he was superannuated. As a magistrate who knew him well says his decisions were not only considered equitable, but always good law. In fact, we have never known of anyone possessed of a finer constitution, and one could easily believe him a year or 2 ago when his heart's action commenced to fail. He was wont to say, "I've never had a headache or taken a dose of physic in my life." In 1867, an irate Teuton, who, strange to say, did not know the governor even by sight, followed him through his paddock, vowing vengeance and calling out to him, "I'll have you up before old Featherstone." Imagine the man's surprise when the governor turned around, snapped his fingers and exclaimed, "I don't care for that old Featherstone." Such a contempt for the majesty of the law, as represented by a known terror to evildoers, quite staggered his accuser, who refrained from further trouble. He ever looked upon the best side of human nature, but when a cowardly or dishonest action come under his notice, his denunciation of the offender was scathing and severe. During his last illness, which extended over 5 or 6 weeks, his kindly consideration for others continued to be as conspicuous as it had ever been. Though at times suffering intense pain, his thoughts were for those around him. Patient and resigned, he would sometimes exclaim, "The Lord has been very good to me. I wish he would take me now and give me rest." His supplication was mercifully granted. A more peaceful deathbed was never witnessed. Cheerful to the end, the governor sighed his last and glided away into the quiet haven of us all. And Cuthbert Featherstonaugh Sr. and his wife Susan and daughter Adelaide are buried at the Old Hamilton Cemetery, and there is a plaque that's erected with information on him next to their gravestone. On the 17th of February 1893, it mentions the probate by A.C. Palmer and Son of Hamilton solicitors appointed his son Cuthbert executor in Australia, and his nephews Theobald and Arthur Featherstonaugh executors to act in Great Britain and Ireland. He bequeathed his estate at Corrie, with a dwelling house and buildings thereon, also his horses, cattle, crops, farming implements, carriages, stable furniture, harness, bridles and saddles, his furniture and every other article, excepting money and securities for money, in the said house were bequeathed to his daughter, Adelaide Wotton. The balance of his personal estate, excepting that in Great Britain and Ireland, after payment of just debts, funeral and testamentary expenses, he bequeathed to his said daughter. Out of his personal estate in Great Britain or Ireland, he bequeathed £2,000 to his daughter, Grace Leamonth, and the residue equally to his daughters, Susan Poussard and Frances Sitwell. Also land in Confey, County of Kildare, Ireland, as joint tenants, the survivor to take the whole. And the will was sworn as to property in Victoria at the value of £1,778 and personal £653, totalling £2,431. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh Jr.'s siblings. Theobald, known as Theodore, was born in 1828 in Ireland. He died in 1909 at Glenelg, near Hamilton, Victoria. He did not marry. There was a short memorial in a newspaper. We regret to announce the death of Mr. Theobald Featherstonaugh, a very old resident of this district, who has reached the ripe age of 81 years. On the death of his father, the deceased succeeded to the property known as Corrie Estate, where he passed a quiet, unobtrusive life with his sister, Mrs. John Learmonth. He never took part in public affairs and was known to a comparative few. By these, however, he was held in high esteem. The second child, Alfred William, was born about 1830 in Ireland. He married Catherine Cameron, known as Kate, in 1871, and he died in 1875 in Deniliquin, and his wife Kate died in 1879. And there's an article based on his death, Featherstonaugh. On the 19th of February, 1875, at Yanco Station, the deceased gentleman had been ailing for some time and caught a severe cold, and finally cerebral congestion set in, to which he rapidly succumbed, aged 42. And his wife Kate, 4 years later, on the 20th of November 1879 at Violet Creek, Kate, eldest daughter of the late Donald Cameron of Violet Creek Station, Hamilton, and relict of the late Alfred Featherstonaugh, died aged 38 years. The third child, Adelaide Susan, was born in January 1832 in Ireland. She married Edmund Wynne Wotton in 1860 in Hamilton, Victoria. So in 1861, they were living at Barjug Station near Mansfield. And by 1864, were living at Corrie, so the property of her father. And they had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. She died in 1899. Edmund drowned on the 22nd of December 1882 at the Warrego River in Queensland. He was droving sheep at the time of his death. And the death notice reads, on the 11th of January 1899 at Corrie, Hamilton, Adelaide Susan, widow of Edmund Wynne Wotton and eldest daughter of the late Cuthbert Featherstonaugh of Corrie, Hamilton, aged 68 years. The fourth child, Louisa Elizabeth, was born in October 1833 in Ireland. She married John Macpherson on the 8th of July 1858 in Hamilton, Victoria. They had 1 son and 6 daughters. Louisa died in August 1924 in Middlesex, England, aged 90. And there's some information about her husband, John Macpherson. So John Macpherson was born in 1833 as well. He was born at Limestone Plains at a property called Springbank. He was the second son of John Macpherson, who was a landowner and squatter, and his wife Helen Nee Watson. His grandfather, Peter Macpherson of Skye, had brought his family on the Triton to Sydney in 1825 and settled near Bathurst. John Alexander was probably the first European boy to be born on the site of Canberra. About 1840, he moved with his family to Melbourne, where he went to school. His early experience was mostly pastoral, but in 1853 and 1854, he attended the University of Edinburgh for a term, and then in 1861 returned to Australia to study law at the University of Melbourne. In 1866, he was admitted to the Victorian Bar, but unlike his brother James, he did not practice. For some time before 1861, Macpherson lived in the Western District, and for 4 years he managed Croxton, one of his father's stations, and that's where he married Louisa. He did own some 2,000 acres of the Croxton estate by 1877, and he also shared near Niran, a station of 62,000 acres, which was managed by his brother William. Macpherson entered the Legislative Assembly in November 1864 for Portland. From February 1866 to July 1878, he was a member for Dundas. At 35 years old, he became Chief Secretary and resigned on the 8th of April 1870. He went on a European tour then after he left the political arena, and afterwards he settled in London. Hence why Louisa did die in London. The fifth child, Susan, was born in 1836 in Ireland. She married Eugene Possard, a Frenchman, on the 12th of April 1857 in Portland, Victoria. Eugene died in New Amsterdam, Guyana, South America, in October 1881. Eugene had advertisements for selling gold puddling machines in Melbourne papers in 1857, so I'm assuming he came out in order to try and sell his goods. Susan was recorded as living in England in 1891, and she died in Surrey, England in 1917, aged 81. The sixth child, Frances Jane Featherstonaugh, known as Fanny to the family, was born in 1839 in Ireland. She married Reverend Alfred Hurt Sitwell in July 1859 in Booterstown, Ireland. They lived in Middlesex and Kent in England, Calcutta and Stepney. Reverend Sitwell was curate of St Philip's, Stepney in 1861, vicar of Minster Thanet, priest in ordinary to the Queen and honorary chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Sitwells had two sons, Frederick Archibald Edward, who died at the age of 13, and Francis Albert, known as Bertie Sitwell, who died in Davos, Switzerland, aged 18. Their marriage was unhappy and they lived apart from about 1871. Frances earned her living as an essayist. Frances was the secretary for the College of Working Women, and also in her job as an essayist was a translator and a reviewer. Albert died in 1894. She then married Sidney Colvin, a British curator and literary and art critic, on the 7th of July 1903 at St Marylebone Parish Church, London in England. It says Mr Sidney Colvin, keeper of the prints and drawings at the British Museum, and Frances, fourth daughter of the late Cuthbert Featherstonaugh of Darlaston, Westmeath and Corrie, Victoria, and widow of the late Reverend Alfred Hurt Sitwell, vicar. Sidney was 6 years younger than Fanny. In the early 1870s, Sidney met Fanny. In the late summer of 1873, Colvin became friends with Robert Louis Stevenson, who was then a young man and an unpublished author. Both men were attracted to Fanny. Stevenson wrote to her for years and was very close with her. Despite or because of this attraction, the men remained firm friends, and Colvin was a significant editor of Stevenson's work. Sidney was knighted in 1911, so therefore Fanny was known as Lady Colvin. Sidney and Fanny had 20 years of married life before she died on the 1st of August 1924 in Kensington, England. So the death notice was printed in the Western Morning News on the 4th of August 1924. Death of Lady Colvin. Lady Colvin, wife of Sir Sidney Colvin, who died at Kensington on Friday, leaves a name inseparable from English life and letters in the past 50 years. Her influence in encouraging the genius of Robert Louis Stevenson is already well known from his published letters, and among many leading men who were her friends may be mentioned as Robert Browning, Burne-Jones, George Meredith, Cotter Morrison and George Howard, and afterwards the Earl of Carlisle. Lady Colvin was first married to Reverend Albert Sitwell, on whose death she became wife of Sir Sidney Colvin in 1903. And another obituary printed in the Scotsman, death of Lady Colvin, friend of Robert Louis Stevenson. Lady Colvin's death on Friday has diminished the circle of those who can speak with intimate knowledge of Robert Louis Stevenson. To many of the most notable men and women of her day, she was a sympathetic and consistent friend, and for 50 years her influence has been an acknowledged force in the world of letters. Her encouragement and wise guidance have been acknowledged in particular by Robert Louis Stevenson, who owned that she knew how to curb, control and direct his aspirations. As a friend of Stevenson's, she has an assured literary immortality, for his letters to her are among the great things in literature. Frances Jane Featherstonaugh, who was to become Lady Colvin, was born in Ireland more than 80 years ago. She came from Northumbrian stock, which had long been settled in Ireland. When she was still a child, the lands belonging to her family had to be sold under the Encumbered Estates Act, and the family went abroad in the 50s. 5 years at Frankfurt helped her give her a love of music and German literature, particularly the poetry of Heine and Goethe. On her return to Ireland, her education was continued under governesses and tutors. Through her love of music, she was brought into contact with Mr. Albert Sitwell, a relative of Archbishop Tate, who was intended for the church. Her family at this time moved to Australia, where she also went, but in a year she returned and married Mr. Sitwell. In 1903, she married Sidney Colvin, himself a distinguished man of letters. The seventh child, Grace Caroline, was born in Ireland in 1844. She married Alexander Learmonth in Victoria in 1868. Her husband was a bookkeeper for John Brewer, the owner of Mary Merrigle Run in the Lachlan area from 1884, and he died in 1894 in Hillston, New South Wales, and Grace died in Wallara, New South Wales in 1924, aged 80. They had 5 children. And the death notice for Grace, Mrs. J. Learmonth. The death occurred in Sydney on Thursday of Mrs. Grace Learmonth, relict of the late John Learmonth. Mrs. Learmonth was a daughter of the late Mr. Featherstonaugh, one of the early police magistrates in the Hamilton district. She resided for many years in Melbourne and later at Corrie, Hamilton, where she quietly interested herself in many philanthropic works, exerting great activity in patriotic work during the war. About a couple of years ago, Mrs. Learmonth removed to the northeastern district and was on a visit to her daughter in Sydney when she passed away. And Cuthbert and Flora's children. The first child, Cuthbert Murchison Featherstonaugh, so he was the third to carry that name, was born at St Leonard's, New South Wales on the 10th of February 1879. He was educated at the Church of England Grammar School in North Sydney before enlisting in the Boer War. From 1900 to 1901, Cuthbert served in the 1st Battalion, New South Wales Mounted Rifles, in South Africa and attained the rank of Lance Corporal. After returning home, he completed a second deployment with the 3rd Battalion of the New South Wales Mounted Rifles, during which time he was commissioned as a lieutenant. For his service, he was awarded the Queen's South Africa Medal and the King's South Africa Medal. Cuthbert married Victoria Lynn in March 1912 at Sydney, New South Wales. Victoria had been born in Albury, and her father William was the Premier of New South Wales between 1899 and 1901. And the marriage notice says Miss Victoria Lynn, youngest daughter of Sir William Lynn MHR, was married to Featherstonaugh at St Philip's Church on Thursday last by Canon Bellingham. The wedding was extremely quiet on account of the serious illness of Sir William Lynn. They had a stillborn daughter, Mary Emma, on the 13th of February 1913 in Mossman. On the 4th of May 1915, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the Australian Imperial Force for service overseas during World War I, being allocated to the 12th Light Horse Regiment. The regiment sailed from Australia in June and was deployed without their horses to Gallipoli in August. Returning to his mounted role after the evacuation and being promoted to captain, the 12th Light Horse joined the forces defending the Suez Canal before advancing into the Sinai Desert and Israel. The 12th and its sister regiment, the 4th, were unleashed on Beersheba at the Gallop on the 31st of October 1917, an action which has gone down in history as the Charge of Beersheba. Having been promoted to Major, Cuthbert commanded the B Squadron during the charge, and during the charge his horse was hit by bullets. Dismounting, he shot his beloved whaler and then charged the Turkish defenders with his pistol. He killed 4 before being shot in both legs. For his action, he was appointed a Companion of Distinguished Order Service and mentioned in dispatches. Cuthbert returned to Australia on the 20th of January 1919. Following the war, he was awarded the 1914-1915 Star, British War Medal and Victory Medal. His wife Victoria died in November 1939, and the death notice states that the death occurred in Sydney of Mrs. Victoria Shaw Featherstonaugh, wife of Colonel C.M. Featherstonaugh of Mungery, Coonamble. The deceased was the daughter of the late Sir William Lynn, a former Premier of New South Wales. When her husband enlisted for service in the Great War, Mrs. Featherstonaugh spent 4 years in Egypt with the Australian Red Cross Society and for some time was in charge of the Australian hospital. She was awarded the MBE at the conclusion of the hostilities. The deceased was the president for several years of the Coonamble branch of the Red Cross Society and a prominent member of the Coonamble CWA. On the 26th of March 1942, and aged 63, Cuthbert was once more called upon for his country's defence, being promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and appointed commandant of the E Group Volunteer Defence Corps. His appointment was extended from November 1943 to February 1944. His sister was listed as next of kin. He married Lillian Doreen Crisp in Sydney in 1945, aged 66. Lillian had previously been married to another landowner in the Coonamble district and had been widowed for a number of years before their marriage. Cuthbert passed away aged 82 on the 20th of September 1961 at Chatswood in New South Wales. On my Facebook page, I'll put a portrait of Major Cuthbert Featherstonaugh. This was a sketch that was done when Lambert went to Beela in March 1918, and he was approached by Major Featherstonaugh and asked permission to take some pencil notes. While there, he watched the divisional sports, which was probably the subject of the sketch that was made. The second child, Albany Murchison Featherstonaugh, was born on the 10th of March 1882 at Wallara in New South Wales. He was living in London at the age of 18 and returned to Australia by the time he was 21 to be overseer at Minchingauri, New South Wales in the Namoy area. He married Agatha Mary Mackenzie in April 1913. The marriage record states, on April 24th at Delby, Albany Murchison, youngest son of Cuthbert Featherstonaugh of Mungary, Coonamble, to Agatha, youngest daughter of Hector Mackenzie, Mount Pleasant, Delby, Queensland. They had 3 children, Sheila, who married later in life and had no children, Richard, who fought in World War II, who married Denise Cheeseman, known as Dell, in Sydney in 1949, and they had 2 children, and he farmed in Western Australia, and a third child, John. Agatha was running a boarding house in Roma, Queensland in 1919, and it seems by 1919 that they had separated. They divorced in October 1927. And the divorce decree says, on the ground of desertion, decree nisi for divorce was granted yesterday for Agatha Mary Featherstonaugh, formerly Mackenzie, versus Albany Featherstonaugh. And their third child, Dorothea Murchison Featherstonaugh, was born in Sydney on the 8th of September 1886. She was a nurse at Randwick Hospital before marrying James Archibald Macmillan in Sydney on the 25th of April 1916. And their marriage record states Macmillan Featherstonaugh at St Mark's, Darling Point. James A., son of the late John Campbell Macmillan of Wandilla, Kerrang, Victoria, to Dorothea Murchison, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert Featherstonaugh of Mungary, Coonamble. Her best friend was Dorothea McCullough. James was an auctioneer living at Holbrook in New South Wales at the time of their marriage, and his father, John Campbell Macmillan, was a barrister. James enlisted in World War I on the 21st of February 1917 and was in the 28th 8th Light Horse Regiment and fought in the Middle East and Egypt. He was on active service in January 1918 when his twin sons were born and when his infant son James died. He returned in September 1919. In 1919 they were living in Victoria. In 1921 James was a public servant. He was then a stock and station agent in Nyngan, New South Wales in 1930, and then in 1931 they were living in Moonee Ponds, Victoria, where James was a factory manager. By 1930 they were living at Bracklin at Blackheath, New South Wales, which is where James died in 1934. It says James Archibald Macmillan, aged 51, was cremated at Rookwood. The deceased was working in the garden at his residence Blackheath when he collapsed and died. Dorothea then lived with her brother Cuthbert at his property, Mungary, Coonamble, in 1942, while both her brother and her son William were at war. They had 3 children, twins William James Campbell Macmillan and James Featherstonaugh Macmillan, who died at the age of 7 weeks, and Dorothea Featherstonaugh Campbell. William was born at Leura, New South Wales on the 9th of January 1918. He was living in Darlinghurst, New South Wales in 1943, working as a clerk. He then served in World War II, enlisting on the 29th of May 1940 and was discharged on the 12th of November 1945. He was involved in the Western Desert campaigns of Tobruk and El Alamein in New Guinea, at Borneo, and also had served in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, India, and back in Australia. He married Joan Elliott in Victoria in 1948. They lived in Sydney, including in 1958 when his mother was living with them. William was the executor to his uncle Cuthbert's will in 1961. In 1963, William and Joan were living at Yogali near Griffith. Then he was an employment officer living in Nowra in 1968. And by 1972, they were living in Bega. He died at the age of 82. And his death record says William James Macmillan, the 2nd 17th Australian Infantry Battalion, 9th Division, died peacefully on the 5th of August 2000, late of Bega, husband of Joanne, brother of Dorothea Hedger, and father of Prudence and Sally. The Dorothea Featherstonaugh Campbell was born on the 27th of May 1920 in Lura, New South Wales. Her godmother was Dorothea McCullough. She married William Charles John Hedger, a World War II soldier who'd been born in England at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney on the 3rd of March 1943. They owned the property Wingfield near Warren in New South Wales, and they had 3 children. Dorothea died aged 94 in Toowoomba, Queensland in 2014. So the Featherstonaugh family certainly had the benefit of a longevity. As you would have noticed, there were many of the family members who lived well into their 80s and 90s. And there were quite a few family members, particularly Cuthbert Featherstonagh's siblings, who certainly had the means behind them to be educated in England, and some returned to England and marry in England.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.